we normally have this presented at our Economics Network Developments in Economics Education Conference, which was held a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, Doug couldn't make it. It's a long way across to Edinburgh. So he's very kindly agreed to give an online presentation of his paper. This session is co-hosted by the Economics Network. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Doug. Many thanks.
David, thank you for the kind introduction. I really appreciate it. This is actually a paper that I think really fondly of, not just because it's won this award, which I really appreciate, but because this was actually one of the very first, one of my very first economic education papers. It's had a long history. You'll know when you see the data was collected actually a few years ago, but it was also it's one of the first papers written using data from a project here at Cornell that's called the Active Learning Initiative, where we've invested actually quite a bit of resources in developing assessments of learning and also incorporating evidence-based pedagogy into undergraduate classes offered by our department. We've collected a tremendous amount of data through that project, which we have started doing lots of research that we didn't anticipate doing using that data. So this paper, though, it really it focuses on really just three, I think, fairly straightforward questions. Let me share my slides. So it really focuses on just three pretty straightforward questions. The first is how do race and gender predict student performance? And what we're doing there is we're looking for race gaps. Is it true that male and female students have learned different amounts during a class or come out with different performance? And similarly, how important is race? And the race categories we're going to use are really simple. We're going to have two categories: underrepresented minorities and everyone else. Okay, and I'll say that the everyone else is white or Caucasian students and students from Asia, which are quite represented in our classes at Cornell. And then we've got African-American students, Hispanic students, students from other places in the world are the underrepresented students. Okay, so we're going to look for evidence of those gaps in an economics course. And then we're going to see if the race gaps, because we're going to see race gaps, and we're going to see if they differ from male and female students. I'll preview our answer. They do. We see bigger gaps for female students of color than we do male students of color. And then we're going to try to test some theory. We're going to propose, and then we're going to test some theories for why those gaps exist. And then that's going to inform what we can actually do about it. Because the treatment really depends on the root causes of these gaps. Okay, so that's where we're headed. All right. The approach we use is pretty simple. We're going to take one class taught by one instructor, so we're really going to reduce variation from other sources by focusing on that. And it's a class that was taught in 4 separate terms, so we can pool the data from all 4 classes. And we're going to look for gaps in student outcomes. So I'm going to show you lots of regression results, and the regressions are pretty straightforward. Then we're going to see if those racial gaps differ by gender. We're going to propose 5 possible explanations, and then we're going to test 3 of them with other regression models. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so now I want to step back and tell you a bit more about the context. So the class that we're actually operating in. So you can decide whether we can generalize these results to other courses, instructors, institutions. And then I'm going to talk about the data that we have available that we're going to be analyzing. Okay, so It's one course. It's an applied econometrics course. This course is required by the economics major. Most economics majors take the course in their sophomore or junior year. Requires them to have taken an intro statistics course. It requires them to have taken the intro microeconomics course. I would say we get about a third of the students are not economics majors. They come from other departments, and those students, they're pretty motivated. They don't have to be there. They're there because they specifically want this content. Okay. The classes range in size. They're all kind of medium size. So none of them are small and none of them are really big. That's between like 50 and 150 students. Okay. And our sample, this is the 304 students for which we have all the demographic data, all the assessment data, all the survey data that we want. And it's a pretty big chunk of the total number of students that were actually registered in these classes. So it's not actually a very weird selected sample at all. Okay. The curriculum's nearly identical in all four terms, and the pedagogy is quite similar. I always change something when I teach, but sometimes it's a major thing and other times it's a minor thing. And between fall 17 and spring 2019, there are not major changes. In all 4 semesters, the class has lots of active learning. The students there is a significant amount of lecture, but I also ask the students to answer questions using polling software throughout. There are usually 5 to 10 questions per class. There are also small group activities in the class. And so most classes have 1, sometimes 2, but usually 1 kind of 10 to 15 minutes small group activity. And it's either a case study where I'll give them kind of a research question and a bunch of tables that are generated using methods that they've learned, and they have to interpret the results and then critique the study and talk about what could be better about it and what could be worse, or the assumptions valid. And invention activities. So these are activities where they try to figure something out before I've told them how to do it. Okay, so they're definitely not kind of deliberate practice. The idea is that these activities, they prime them for future learning. They don't usually know how to solve the problem. So I'll say we need a measure of, but the classic invention activity is to show people data on people throwing baseballs at targets and come up with a measure of how good are the throws. And so they come up with average distance. And then you say, well, how do we distinguish between data where the throws are often quite far away from the target and data where the throws are quite close to the middle of the target? And they basically have to invent variance. And so it's things like that, but in mostly a regression model context. And then finally, the class has a group project outside class where they come up with their own research question and work on it. So there's a lot of peer interaction in this class. There's a lot of inside the classroom and outside the classroom. All right, so that's the class. By the way, I should say, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any point. We've got a full hour. And I'm only planning to talk for maybe 30 minutes, and then the rest is all questions, but feel free to interrupt at any point. All right. We have quite a bit of data on these students from the 4 semesters. First, we have their final exam data. In all 4 of these semesters, these were pre-COVID, and all the exams that they take are in-person exams. The final exam is something where it was handed out and then collected, and they never saw it again. And so we feel pretty good about giving that same exam year over year. So it's comparable. It's 25% of their course grade, which here is high stakes. I understand anything that's not 100% is low stakes in the UK, but here it's high stakes. And it's several maybe 6 to 8, I can't remember exactly what the number was, multi-part questions that have short answers. Okay, so it's a handwritten exam. That we have a very detailed rubric. And so we had several of the exams regraded by other people and then compared answers or compared scores, and they're very, very similar. So we feel really good about the reliability of the measure, even though it's not multiple choice. But it's highly, there's a lot of human capital that goes into the grading of these exams. It's a long exam. It's not open book, and they don't get full access to their notes, but they do get to bring 3 pages double-sided to the exam with anything they want. And that way they don't have to necessarily memorize. They're not focused on the memorization, for the exam, because they can write down formulas that they don't necessarily want to remember. Okay. A week, during the last week of classes, we also give a test called the Applied Econometric Skills Assessment. It's low stakes in the sense that students get a little bit of extra credit for participating for just taking the test. Oops, sorry. For just participating in just taking the test. It's multiple choice, so it's automatically graded. We invested a lot of energy in this test. It's really hard to write good multiple choice tests. It takes a long time. It's in person, bubble sheets. Students have 45 minutes, closed book, closed notes. And if anyone wants to look at the questions or see what the learning goals are that the test evaluates, they can go to econassessments.org, and anybody can actually set up an online version of this test for their students if they want to. And it's all automated, and they'll get reports generated when your students are done with the test. So that's the other measure. These are the 2 measures we're going to use at the end of the term to test learning. All right. We have a couple measures of student skills at the beginning of the term. We give a statistics assessment that's similar in form to the Applied Econometrics assessment. It's multiple choice. It's required, but the grade that students get on this test does not affect their grade for the course. But we found it's a pretty good measure of their statistics skills. And then we use GPA as a measure of how good a student is this. And we have their GPA at the beginning of the term. Okay, we have for administrative data, we have demographics, we've got race, gender, class, year, major. We have parental education, so we can calculate whether or not this is a student who's the first in their family to go to college, and we have whether they're a native English speaker. Okay, and then finally, the last bit of data we're gonna apply in this paper is a study survey that was given at the same time as the final exam, where we ask students to report, on average, how many hours did you spend during the semester studying for this class? And then separately, how many hours did you spend specifically studying for this final exam? And we asked some questions about how they studied. So did you mostly study by yourself? Did you mostly study with friends? And then we gave them a list of about 6 or 7 study strategies, and they could check which ones they used and which ones they didn't. And we kind of made some semi-arbitrary decisions about what we considered effective, because we just wanted to distinguish the students that read the book and highlighted, which is not terribly effective, and the students that looked at old exams and then read the solutions, not very effective, versus the students that actually would do things, work through old questions themselves, create new problems. And we called those effective study strategies. Okay. So that's the data we're going to analyze. All right. Now, are there gaps? Okay. So if we look at the final exam scores, we regress those final exam scores on just a plain old dummy variable for female. There seems to be a gap, but it's not statistically significant at all. Okay. So average scores for male and female students, not very different. Now, when we control for underrepresented minority, we see pretty big gap, quite statistically significant. The URM students are definitely doing worse. Yeah, Carlos.
Oh. Can you just explain the division you made along race? I suspect it's because of sample size. You want to keep the two, but what was the reasoning for adding the Asian students with the whites and everyone else? What was the reason?
So Asian students are really overrepresented in economics courses in the US, especially at Cornell. We've got a very high Asian population, and those students, they tend to come from relatively well-off families, and they tend to do quite well in the classes. And so underrepresented minority is a fairly standard term here.
Okay.
So that's why. I mean, we have run these analyses separating out the Asian students. They tend to do a little better than the white students. The other thing I didn't say here is all of our outcomes are standardized. So everything we're looking at here is in terms of standard deviations. And so we're looking at URM students are half a standard deviation below, which is not great. It's not great at all. Okay. But then we were really curious if the gap differed for female and if the URM gap was different for female and male students. Yes, Amira. Oh, you're muted, Amira.
No,
there we go.
No muted. Can you give us an idea how big is the subsample for the minority students?
Minority students are about 22% of the sample.
Okay.
So of the 300, about 50, somewhere around there. Actually, I have the numbers at the end. I have a whole slide about limitations of the study, and the sample size is a huge one. We don't have where there aren't very many, but they're quite different from the other students. Okay, so we're seeing a pretty big gap. All right, so then we want to know, is that gap different for male and female students? And what we see is that it's a pretty big difference. And so what this implies is that the URM gap for males is 0.34, and for females, it's the sum of these two. It's about minus 0.95. So it's about a full standard deviation. Now, Amira, I'm sure you're wondering, well, how many female URM students do you have in your sample? And the answer is 22. It's not very many at all. But those 22 students, it's not none, and we're seeing quite significant differences between those students and the other students. Okay. All right. So the next question is why? Why are we seeing these URM gaps, and why are these gaps different for male and female students? Okay. Before I show that, if we control for college year, first generation status, whether you're an econ major, none of those things have controlling for those doesn't affect the gender URM gaps at all. Okay, it's not that the URM students are more likely to be first generation, and that's why we're seeing this. Okay, these are not very different when we control for those characteristics. We lose some statistical power, but not even all that much statistical power. Okay. All right. So then the question is why? Okay, and so we have 5 potential explanations here, and I'm sure with an audience this big, there will be more that you can suggest, but I'm just going to lay out 5 here. So the first one is maybe it's differences in incoming preparation. Maybe what's happening is the URM students are coming in and they have weaker math skills, or they just don't have the kind of the preparation that the other students have. Okay, and we have decent measures of preparation, so we're gonna look at that. Another possibility is that it's stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is a theory from psychology that when a group has negative, is associated with negative stereotypes, and they're in a high pressure situation, that they're thinking, I'm representing my group, maybe other people are right, I don't know. That causes stress and distraction, and it causes them to underperform. Okay, so even if they're not naturally going to perform any worse, that high stress situation can definitely make them perform worse. Okay, and so we've got two different tests that we can look at. We've got a high pressure test and a low pressure test. A third possibility is maybe that some students, they have different, more effective or study behaviors, or maybe they just study more. And maybe that could explain some of this. Fourth is role model theory, which is, this is a class that's taught by a white guy, and maybe that white guy is not very inspiring to the non-white male students. We can't test this. Okay, we can't test this because we don't have any variation. But I'm not saying that it's not a possibility. All I'm saying is that we only have the one instructor, and I didn't try to vary my gender or ethnicity between these classes. Okay, and then finally, it's possible that the students came in with different interest in the subject. Okay? And so if you're more interested in it, you invest more. And we can't test this now either. Okay. So the problem here is we don't have any variation. And the problem here is we don't have measures of intrinsic interest, but we will. Okay, so we are actually measuring, we are asking students about intrinsic interest in economics at the beginning of the term in classes since this time. And so if we redo this analysis with more current data, we should be able to answer this question. Okay. All right. So let's look at preparation. Okay. So in this model, what we're doing is we're adding GPA and our measure of statistical skills. So this is our stats skills, and this is general kind of school ability. Okay, and they're very predictive of I don't know what this is, but they're very predictive of performance on the final exam. So each point on a 4-point scale of GPA that you have increases your final exam score by 1.23, hugely predictive. And similarly, each standard deviation increase in your statistics skills at the beginning of the term is associated with a 0.23 increase in a standard deviation. Okay, so this is at the same time not surprising and a little disturbing. Okay, it would be really great if everybody walked in and the course was structured such that it provided support at the bottom, such that everybody had an equal chance of succeeding in the course, and we don't see that. Okay, Carlos.
No, I find it peculiar that econ major actually do worse. So why would
it's not that surprising,
right?
At least in this context, and that's because the people that are econ majors, it's required for all of them, and the people that are not econ majors really want to be there.
Self-selection. Then.
It's totally, they're a totally self-selected group. Yeah. All right. So, but for this paper, the more interesting piece is over here. which is what happens to the male URM gap and what happens to the female URM gap. And so we go from a negative precisely estimated gap. When we control for other demographics, that male gap goes down a little and it loses that it does seem that controlling for prior preparation entirely eliminates the male URM gap. Okay, that's what we're seeing in this course, in this data. The female URM gap, on the other hand, remember, this is only the difference between the gap for males and females. The female gap has gone from the sum of these two, okay, which is minus 0.9, to the sum of these two, which is minus about 0.5. So it's smaller, but it's still pretty big and statistically significant. Okay, so it explains part of the female URM gap, but not all of it. So our next try is to look at for evidence of stereotype threat. And what we're doing there is we're going to say, well, do we see these same gaps when we look at the low stakes assessments? Yes, Amira.
Can you go back to the previous slide just to look
Yes.
at the URM female coefficient here? And I see it's becoming bigger when you include all these controls. So would you
hold on. So when we go from right here, so are you saying between 3 and 4, or are you saying between 4 and 5?
between, well, yeah, 4 and 5, but obviously between 3 and 5 as well.
So remember the URM gap for female, the coefficient is telling you the difference between the male URM gap and the female URM gap.
Mm-hmm.
And the female URM gap itself is actually the sum of those two. And so if we add those two, it goes from minus 0.9 to minus 0.5. So the difference between the gaps is getting a little bit bigger, but the gap itself is getting smaller.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And so the next step is to say, well, does all of this have, this is a very high stakes test. Does all of this happen with the low stakes test? And we find with the low stakes test is there's a moderately significant URM effect, and that goes away entirely once we control for prior preparation. Okay. So that URM effect, we're actually seeing once you control for prior preparation on the low stakes assessments, the male URM students are doing better, and the effect for women, okay, so the female URM effect is now plus 0.03, which is almost nothing. Okay. Now, are the stakes the only difference between these two tests? No. Okay, there are other differences between the two tests. We believe that the most important difference is the stakes, but the fact is the low stakes test is also shorter, and it's given earlier in the semester. So it's given before students do their serious studying for the final exam. Okay, and so you could argue that maybe that's what's actually driving it, is the timing of the test or the length of the test. Okay, we don't think that's true, but it could be true. All right, the third explanation that we're going to test is study behavior. And so what we wanted to see is how do gender and race predict study behavior? And so the really interesting thing that comes out of this is when we look at regular study hours and we regress them on female URM and our same interaction, the main finding is that the female students study more. Okay, anyone that's ever been in a classroom and looked around, this is not going to come as a surprise. It's also true that they studied a lot more for the final exam. Okay. Now, we didn't observe much in the way of a gender gap, even though and you might say, well, the female students are studying more. Why aren't they doing better than the male students? And that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. Okay, it tells me that there's still something going on. But when we look at gaps for URM students, and specifically gaps for male versus female URM students, we don't see really any difference to speak of. Yeah, Ashley.
I just wonder whether you collected any information on if anyone's doing part-time work around their studies.
So this is Cornell. It's very few students are doing part-time work.
Okay.
And the students that are doing it through their financial aid. And so there it would be nice to have that measure. We don't have it, but I'm not sure how I would interpret it.
Yeah, and I guess if they're studying lots anyway, then it's
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right too. Yeah. All right. Those are all the numbers I want to show you. So to summarize, we're seeing large significant gaps for male URM students relative to non-URM male students. And among female students, URM female students are doing significantly worse than non-URM female students. It seems that prior preparation can explain the whole gap for male students, but it only explains about half the gap for female students. And it does seem that we have evidence consistent with stereotype threat, because we don't see those same gaps when we look at a low stakes test given at the end of the semester. And I should also say that if you look at correlation between the two exams, it's very high. Okay, so they're both measuring very similar things, but at different times and in different contexts. Carlos.
I'm just wondering, the entry criteria for this URM students, are they more or less the same as non-URM, or did they get a bonus, let's say, and get it slightly lower grades at entry?
So that's a really loaded question. So the answer is, I believe, but I'm not speaking as a representative of the university, but I believe that the admission standards are different for URM and non-URM students.
Okay.
I will also say, as a representative of the university, that Cornell is abiding by the recent Supreme Court decision of just a few weeks ago that says that we are not allowed to condition admission separately based on race. And so we are abiding by the law.
Okay.
But yeah, I do think that in practice, the preparation of the students is pretty different.
Now, I don't want to catch you out or anything, obviously. We've got something similar here in England. We've got targets to meet. But my question was more, sometimes students from those backgrounds get additional help once they go to ensure that the level comes up. And I was just wondering if they get access to additional support or, you know.
So that's a great question too. So the answer is yes. We do have several programs at Cornell that provide extra support for underrepresented groups. We have no quantitative evidence of effectiveness. Although I have a paper with George Orlov where we evaluate a supplemental course, so a 1 credit course that you can take alongside of our introductory microeconomics course that will give you extra support in problem solving and math. And it does seem, and that's mostly taken by underrepresented minority students, although not entirely. And it actually does seem fairly effective. So maybe these gaps would be even bigger otherwise.
Okay.
We don't know. And then study behavior, there are differences, but the differences don't explain the gaps. All right, so what's the problem with the study? Well, first of all, the sample size is small. Oh, we don't have to dwell on limitations. Yeah, Amira.
You mentioned in one of your possible mechanism or explanation the effective role model, although you only have one teacher really. So
Yeah,
how are
that's
you
right.
going to capture that exactly?
Oh, we're not in this paper.
Ah,
I'm
okay.
just saying it's a possible explanation,
Ah, I see.
but we can't evaluate it here.
Yeah.
I mean, I've thought about trying to dress it differently for class and seeing if that made a difference, but I don't think that approach would work very well.
Would students' evaluations, for example, be used in a context of um how they benefit from a type of instruction format, or how well they perceive the tutor to have prepared, or
So I think there are two problems with using course evaluation data to get at it. So one is, I think it's hard to code. You'd have to come up with like pretty reliable, repeatable rules for how to code what people said as kind of how the gender or race of the instructor or their teaching assistants affected behavior. And then you'd also have to trust that people were explicitly aware of what was going on. And my feeling is that a lot of what happens is implicit. So it's not that people get up, they go to class and they say, that's a white male, I feel consciously not inspired. But if I was a Black female and I was and then there was a Black female student, they might be more inspired, but they might not recognize that was the issue. I mean, what I would much rather see is variation in instructor race and gender, and then see if in fact these gaps go away in response. Now, anecdotally, and the data that I have looked at that I have not published on, my feeling is that those effects are small. That what matters much more is how is the behaviors of the faculty, how inclusive how inclusive the classroom is, and I actually think this is really important, which is what are the substantive examples that are used during the teaching. So if I am a female faculty member of color and I stand up and I only talk about, I'm teaching econometrics and all my data comes from the stock market or mergers and acquisitions of aircraft manufacturing firms, I don't think that's going to be terribly inspiring. Whereas I think a white male instructor who talks about a wide range of substantive examples, including examples from healthcare, examples from development economics, examples from labor economics, I think that's going to make a much bigger difference than race, gender of instructor. And I have a little bit of data to back that up, but it hasn't gone through peer review. Let's say that. All right. So I'm going to go back to limitations. So the big one is the sample size is too small. Okay, there's only so much we can say when we only have 300 students. And like this is like, honestly, this is the biggest red flag on the whole study because we've only got 22 here. It's also really hard to generalize. We've got the one institution, the one instructor, the one way of teaching the class, the one content, okay? Everything we're observing here, it might only happen in this context. We don't know. Okay, so how do we fix it? We have to collect more data. We need lots of contexts. We want to do this at like lots of institutions with lots of instructors. And we want lots of students. Okay, and then we want to redo the analysis. Now, if we do that, we get nice, precise, generalizable results. And we can see how the institutional characteristics and the pedagogy characteristics are correlated with these gaps. Now, this criticism and this solution could apply to, I would say, more than half the empirical papers published in economic education. Probably much more than half, actually. And so we need like some way to get past this. And so here's where I say, I have a way. So over the summer, some colleagues at Cornell and outside Cornell have decided to build something called the Economic Education Network for Experiments, which we call IREE. And what it is, it's a set of instructors all over the world that cooperate to run synchronized experiments in the classroom. Right? They can be actual randomized experiments or observational studies. We agree on research questions like, I wonder if the gender gaps we observe are different between male and female students. I wonder why they exist. We come up with study protocols. So maybe we want to know how important is kind of having a speech at the beginning of the term where you lay out explicitly that there are no wrong answers in class. No one should be afraid of giving a wrong answer, and having like behaviors that encourage student participation. How do those actually affect behavior? We're going to standardize treatments and protocols, okay? And then we're going to collect comparable data. So we're going to agree on measures that actually can be used in lots of different contexts. We're going to pool our samples and analyze the data. We've already we've applied for National Science Foundation funding. Literally as of yesterday, we applied for National Science Foundation funding for building this network and running our first study. If you want to participate in this, you can join right here. There's a link to where you can express interest. When you express interest, you're joining. I'll tell you right now. It's going to be hard to get rid of us once you're in. And once we actually have a kind of a true web portal off the ground, you'll be able to propose studies, look at ongoing studies, have discussions about this stuff. To tell us what you're teaching and what you are interested in, and get matched up with appropriate studies. Okay, I'm happy to talk. I can talk for a long time about this and why it's important and how we're actually going about it. But I see it as a treatment for this. And we all have this problem. So anyway, I'll stop there. We still have, I guess, 15 minutes for questions. And so happy to take any questions you might have about any of this. Yeah. All right.
Well, I've got the obvious one, with the policy implications. I mean, what can be done to improve this? I mean,
yeah, so
I think the result is probably similar in other places, but what can be done?
Well, I mean, I think there are two. I think the big one, if you want to, so I think prior preparation is really important. And so anything you can do to have extra support early in the semester for those students that are less prepared is going to help. That in itself has two parts. First, you have to identify who those students are. And after their first midterm exam is generally too late. We give this math test at the very beginning of the semester. And I think we don't, even here, we probably don't do enough with that data. But then reaching out specifically to the students that do badly on that test and giving them access to like online modules, telling them exactly where the tutoring is, having a lot of office hours and really pushing them to come to office hours and ask questions. I think that's a big part of it. Mm-hmm. Now, the other piece is the stereotype threat. And that I think is hard. We don't have a lot of evidence for treatments that work. I mean, reducing stakes, you can spread it out. I mean, there's actually a fair amount of research that says it's better to just give grades based on low stakes assessments that are given throughout the semester. Some institutions you have flexibility to do that, others you don't. And I think that's probably the big one, is actually reducing the stakes of individual exams. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Tomek.
Hello. Question for you, but because you were talking about the correlation, and I wonder, there is a possibility to conduct this causal inference procedures, because I'm going to publish a paper about the foreign languages and the influence on wages, and this Perl approach is very, in my opinion, very useful to your data, I suppose, because it's a mixture of experimental and observation type of data.
So I think causal effects of race and gender, even just philosophically, they're hard. Because when I talk to people who study causal effects, they say, well, what is a causal effect? It's, if I ran the experiment where I changed this variable, what would happen? And it's hard to even know what it means to change someone's gender or race. On the other hand, I think experiments are critical for understanding the impact of treatments. So observationally, different people do different things in their classrooms. Some people have really inclusive classrooms, other people don't. But they're also but those classrooms, they differ on lots of other dimensions that are unmeasured. And so that's a case where if you can randomize who does what, that'll actually give you it takes care of all of these unobserved differences that might be correlated with who's using the particular method. So I think these observational studies, they can only get you so far. I'm really curious about influence of, so you're saying foreign languages. So this is students whose native language is not English, but you're teaching in English?
Yes.
I mean, I think you can randomize kind of support programs for those people, but I think you're stuck with observational studies if you want to know if you want to know about differences between student outcomes for people that do and do not have English as a first language. So I'm really curious how you go about it.
It's how to say, it's not about the it was a question about wages and how one or two foreign languages influence wages, and it was my first attempt to use this Perl approach and this graph, and it's quite good, how to say, a way to, to find this possible source of disturbance, and how to apply first of all, how to apply this instrumental variables approach.
Right. So it is true that in this exact applied econometrics class that I talked about today, most of the class is actually about how to get causal effects out of observational data. And there are lots of methods, and instrumental variables are one. And it's actually, I think, one of the big reasons why economists have so much to contribute to education research is because we have this really relevant toolbox. And so there are instruments for things like foreign languages that we can take advantage of. I think there's a lot of scope for, when you can't randomize something, you can randomize encouragement to do something. and then use instrumental variables methods to get the causal effect of that thing that you're encouraging people to do. So I've tried to do this with office hours attendance, where I want people to come to office hours. I want to know what the effect of office hours is on student outcomes, but I can't really randomize I can't randomize and say, you have to go to office hours and you can't go to office hours. But I can randomize encouragements to go to office hours and then back out the causal effects. So things like that. I think there's a lot of scope for interesting studies by economists about using those techniques. Amira.
Actually, I was going to talk about the attendance element you just mentioned, and also whether you have maybe information in your model about class attendance or lecture attendance by both genders and the minority, and how you could maybe use that to predict and explain, well, yes, female students study a lot, but is their engagement and attendance in the classes where they prepare for exam is as high of other students? And the other question is, I don't know what is going on in Cornell, but do you have, for example, contextual offers where you give students from certain socioeconomic background offers to admission, even though they don't meet the, let's say, the academic or GPA criteria for entering that particular course? Is that happening in your school, or because then this could explain a little bit more on the prior preparation elements, because you include the GPA, but is there another layer of that because some of the students are actually coming from certain backgrounds and they have lower achievement entering to university, and so that increases the gap?
So I can't make any statements about admissions policies that Cornell has had in the past or will have in the future. Okay. But I think it would be reasonable to believe, for someone to believe, that it's exactly what you described, that the admission standards are lower for underrepresented students. I will also say that that's not legal anymore since the Supreme Court decision from a few weeks ago. And so that will change. Now, maybe there's a scope for like exploiting this change in admissions policy moving forward. That would be pretty interesting. But I also think that admissions is really complicated. And now there's going to be a bigger focus on diversity statements that students submit. So maybe in the end, the same students might end up getting admitted, but for on paper, quite different reasons. It's hard to know. Now, going back to your first question about attendance, we don't actually have good attendance data for the students in these specific classes in these specific semesters. But since then, we've gathered a lot of data about attendance. And what we know is that female students are way more likely to attend than male students, but that underrepresented minority students attend less than non-underrepresented minority students. And that could be part of the problem. It could very well be part of the problem. Yeah. Any other questions? We have time for one more. No? All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. It was great to have this opportunity to share this paper. And I really appreciate International Review of Economic Education for doing this and for just doing it all. There's great work in IREE that I really appreciate. So thank you all.
Okay, so many thanks, Doug, for agreeing to give your paper today, and many thanks to the audience for coming and asking such pertinent questions.
Yeah,
okay.
Much appreciated.
All right, thank you very much, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.